This is how the U.S. military changed since 2001. It's a video from Task and Purpose. They are a military news source, and they write articles and things like that. So I'm kind of curious what they are going to show about how the military has changed since 2001.
9/11 changed our world and created a new global threat on a level that had never been seen before. A drastic overhaul of the U.S. military was going to be required to successfully fight this battle in the years that followed. The last time U.S. forces had fought an extended ground war was nearly 30 years prior in Vietnam. New tactics, new policies, and even some major cultural shifts would have to be executed to meet this challenge.
So one of the big things that happened, ladies and gentlemen, is that you went from a near-peer threat that we were training for, you know, with the training that during the Cold War against Russia, and even Vietnam was looked at more as like a counterinsurgent operations. COIN is what they call it, counterinsurgent operations. So that's very similar to what, you know, the doctrine that they're talking about in the overhaul that the military went through. Big thing was doctrine and going over what COIN, or counterinsurgent operations, where you're setting up at FOBs, you're doing deployments rather than doing something where it's like, hey, you're at war until the war is over, similar to that of basically what World War II had and the soldiers that had experienced during World War II.
But was the slow-moving, tradition-oriented bureaucracy like the U.S. military up to the task? I believe the top 3 ways the U.S. forces were changed by 9/11 include the backdoor draft, expansion of special forces, and the added roles to regular soldiers. Before we get into this, I want to say I'm not trying to change your mind about whether or not you agree with the United States response to 9/11. My goal here is to present some ways that I think the military has changed since then. I respect if you have a different point of view. I understand this isn't record, it's my theory, and I'll do my best to present it. Between Iraq and Afghanistan,
all that footage there was basically special forces or Rangers.
The U.S. had nearly 200,000 troops deployed at any given time between 2003 and 2015. The military did some quick math in their head and realized they were never going to be able to keep up with this high demand for soldiers without getting really creative. So they extended Army deployments from 12 to 15 months to be able to ensure that soldiers had 12 months of downtime at home before going back to war again. The Defense Secretary at the time, Robert Gates, commented about this, saying, "This recognizes that our forces are stretched. There's no question about that." Even with those extra long deployments, they still couldn't meet their minimum troop numbers, so the military did a couple more things that add up to what some people call the backdoor draft. At the time, if anyone in the government voted to reinstate the draft, it would have been a career-ending move for anyone in politics.
Ain't that the truth?
According to a 2007 Gallup poll, this is the only thing that most of us Americans can actually get together and agree on. Just 18% of Americans thought the U.S. should reinstate the military draft, while 80% agree they shouldn't.
You know, that's a very tough thing, because the whole idea right now, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that don't understand military contracts right now, so anytime that you sign a contract, it's 8-year minimum no matter what you do, and whatever portion of that is done active, and then there's a portion of it that's done either in the reserves, the National Guard, or what's called the IRR, or the Individual Ready Reserve. So let's say you have an 8-year contract, you serve 4 of it for four active years, the remaining 4 of that 8-year contract would be served in the IRR if you choose not to go in either the reserves or the National Guard. The IRR is basically, you are already trained up, let's say World War III happens and they need to respond in some way. That is basically the draft. All the soldiers, personnel, military personnel in general that had gotten out during that time frame within that 4 years, or whatever time is left in their reserve portion of their contract, would be called to duty. And that's kind of how they get around this, is instead of taking people off the street who have never been trained before, or taking people that are within that 4, or again, whatever remaining window of time they have left in that contract, they will then get reinstated into the military to go through with that.
Conscription wasn't an option. Going to war was a lot less fun than going to college. So the burden was shifted back to the military, and they chose to lean on the 1984 Section 12305, Title 10, the infamous stop loss.
Ooh.
This gave the president the power to involuntarily extend a service person's contract. So if they were about to get out, or if they had been sitting at home drinking platies and chilling for the past few years, they could get a letter in the mail calling them back to war. Almost half my platoon in Iraq was made up of stop-lost and reclassed soldiers to fill spots none of them were particularly stoked to be there.
And that's completely true. I know of one guy in particular that he was basically chilling. He was called for muster. Basically, the individual ready reserve, whoever it is, called him and was like, hey, what are you up to? He's like, I'm doing nothing. And they said, hey, cool, because guess what? You're getting pulled in as an artilleryman. You're going to be retrained and you're going to Hawaii, and that's your duty station now. He had been out for like 3 years and was getting his like 4th year ready to be done, got called back in.
The second thing the military did was to change the way they looked at reserve forces. The National Guard had traditionally been used for domestic missions like hurricane relief and holding the country back from the brink of civil war. You know, normal stuff. Was that all a fever dream? The last time the National Guard had been used for major combat operations was when it was all hands on deck for World War I and World War II, with the exception of several thousand deployed in Vietnam. Someone got the bright idea that they could make up for the lack of troops by leaning heavily on the Guard instead of drafting civilians. By 2014, a total of 485 National Guardsmen had been KIA in Iraq and Afghanistan. Air Force Major General William Etter, director of the National Guard Bureau, said, quote, "In the past, the Guard was a strategic reserve, and just like the name, it was held in reserve, waiting for the big one. What happened was there was such a large demand for American military that the Guard became a part of going overseas. So Guard units deployed left and right and were used in new ways. But there was unforeseen consequences for using them in major combat operations for extended periods of time. 35% of National Guard and Reserve troops experienced mental health issues after a deployment, compared to 27% with active duty soldiers."
That's reported too. So think about how many people weren't reporting that stuff. This is me just thinking, this could be completely wrong, but I have a feeling that somebody who's got more of a civilian career on the side in the National Guard might be more willing to go in and get looked at because they aren't living that full day-to-day active duty lifestyle that the military kind of instills, where I feel like when active duty may get this, they have this mantra of like, you just push through everything, you know, it doesn't matter what's going on. You know, if you go in and get looked at for mental health, they take away your job, basically. They take away your opportunity to use a firearm, and your command gets notified, and then you basically have a thing on your back saying, yeah, I went in and got looked at by behavioral health to get myself checked out because I'm not in the right mindset. And they move you to a staff position. You're not with your soldiers anymore, depending on the position you're in. So it really kind of isolates that person, even though that's not the intent. The intent is to get you better. You know, if you need to take a knee type of mentality. The problem is it doesn't do that intent. It doesn't reach that. It still isolates that soldier, makes them feel as if they aren't a part of the team anymore and they can't do their job. And that's a big problem, and that's something that's still ongoing. So I think that maybe the reason that is because of the numbers that are reported, that maybe people are hesitant a little more so on the active duty side to go in and get looked at rather than the National Guard.
The reason for this is because of how jarring it is to transition back to a civilian life in school or at a job straight after coming back from being shot at or blown up. Citizen soldiers feel isolated and they feel like they can't relate to their peers anymore right away. For me, I knew I had finally readjusted back into civilian life when I flipped out over something as minor as getting the wrong mocha frappe latte at Starbucks. Now, I'm not saying expanding the National Guard's role was a bad thing. I was one of those nasty guardsmen myself, and if you asked anyone in the reserves, they say they were eager to get a larger part of the war. But it's still an interesting change brought on by the post 9/11 military. Once that change happened, it's probably here for good. The Guard will always have a bigger role in future wars, even if it's not World War III. The Pareto Principle is an axiom that states 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. It's kind of like a universal law. It's found in sports, business, economics, and also in the military. Special Forces units since 9/11 make up about 2% of the military, and they accounted for about 80% of the work done. This isn't to downplay anyone else's contributions, it's just to point out the massive demands that were placed on SF units since 9/11, in ways that really never happened in past wars. Special operations expanded from 33,000 personnel in 2001 to 72,000 by 2014.
Holy crap.
In 2016, there were 7,500 SF deployed to 80 nations around the world. Their budget had expanded from $2 billion to $10 billion by 2017. The man behind the planning for the Bin Laden raid, Admiral McRaven, claimed, "We are in the golden age of special operations." So SF units were originally created to have soldiers who have some language training, they have training in the culture and geopolitics as well as combat. they would embed with local resistance groups against the common enemy. After 9/11, as the war went on, their responsibilities became more and more focused on handling an extremely long list of bad dudes that needed to take a dirt nap. Hitting an objective and eliminating enemy leadership was the strategy to cut off the snake's head, and no one else could be trusted with some of these operations. The post-9/11 world was a different place. The old approaches to war, where there was a front line or even a border where the war stopped, seemed antiquated today. But the situation started to get out of control. In October of 2018, there was an ambush in Africa that left several Green Berets KIA. Very few Americans and even members of Congress knew we were involved in combat operations in Africa in the first place. Some started to openly question if these special operation units had been given too much free rein. The repeated high-intensity 20 years of deployments took its toll on the mental health of members of the organization.
I don't know if anybody has seen the movie Miracle, but there's an actor that played as, I think, O'Callahan. If I'm not remembering the name correctly, you'll just have to give it a Google. The guy joined Army Special Forces, became a Green Beret after he had completed his time doing hockey and doing a short acting stint with that movie Miracle. And he ended up taking his own life after, multiple combat deployments. So what they're exactly saying is completely true. That's just one case, but they took a big toll. There was actually a guy, he was a Special Forces officer, I think a full bird colonel, completely lost his mind in the same town that I was living when I was in Washington. And he had an AR, was walking around inside his house, and he had his kids basically and wife held hostage inside the home. Police were able to talk him down finally, and he let the kids go. Then he was, telling them that he was going to take his own life, and eventually he surrendered, and the police were able to go in and take care of him and get the help that he needed. But it just shows you that, with how many combat operations they said, the bolstering from, almost more than double the number of personnel that are going into Special Forces at that time and special operations in general, it shows how much they're being utilized, and with that, there's a price to pay for that.
There were a few very high-profile criminal cases, one involving a SEAL suspected of killing a Green Beret. These cases received a lot of media attention, and the public began to ask just how much of the burden of these wars were being placed on the shoulders of a few elite units.
Hockey movie.
When you create units tasked with taking out monsters, sometimes the abyss stares back at you. I want to clarify that while I brought up some of the downsides, I do believe the expansion of the special operations community was by far a net positive. Elite units weren't the only ones whose mission changed. Regular soldiers were also given an entirely new role, from the infantry to the engineers. Yes, every war requires that the infantry adapt and overcome, take on new responsibilities, but in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was nuts. The infantry went from having one real job, close with and destroy the enemy, to being asked to be peacekeepers with restraint and an emphasis on the rules of engagement. Many soldiers felt like a weird mix of police officer and warfighter. From a story written by PFC Alicia Hawk for the Army, she said, quote, "The assistance that the infantry soldiers had begun to provide to the people of Iraq is more diversified than just establishing security in the country. These soldiers serve in the unique role in assisting in reestablishment of the Iraqi government. Wow, no pressure, infantry. All you have to do is eliminate the bad guys, prop up the Iraqi government, and why don't you write out the first draft for this multi-faction peace treaty by noon tomorrow? That would be great." I remember they would give us these 8-hour briefings on what a failed state is and the role of civil service projects as it relates to the security of an area of operations. Yeah, my lower enlisted 19-year-old eyes glossed over real quick. I thought we were here to blow shit up, not play Model UN. But the military needed their troops to think harder about their role in war. From a 2003 Washington Post article, they said, some soldiers complain they're playing roles for which they are ill-prepared. In Bakuba, the domain of the 4th Infantry 2nd Brigade combat engineers who specialize in weapons demolition and building bridges have been given a new mission to drive around in their M113 armored personnel carriers to fight crime. Quote, "We're not peacekeepers, we're heavy combat engineers," said Corporal Ortega. They even had Cav Scouts pretending they were infantry. This is part of where the meme "I'm basically infantry" comes from, because there is some truth to it. A lot of what we would call pogues or person other than grunts were asked to be grunts.
And people that I worked with too, hearing their stories about their deployments and things are absolutely insane. Kicking down doors, doing exactly that, pulling infantry type things that you know, they're still trained to do. Don't get me wrong. MPs, they're trained for the tactical aspect of it. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that because you're recycling units, Reserve, National Guard, and active duty, more so National Guard and active duty, because National Guard still have combat roles. Reservists do not have active combat roles. They have more support roles. It's something to keep in mind that, you know, those different units, everybody tries to train to a standard, right? Everyone tries to do it, but regardless, you're still going to have different products no matter what unit goes in there. And that's just across, even if you're just strictly looking across active duty, you're going to have different products at the end of the day.
Infantry Staff Sergeant McDermott said, "What we provided was microgrants. Each one is about 5,000. We use them to work with various projects, working with sheiks. It's a way to try to better the communities and get independent businesses up and running, which will help to start improving the economy," end quote. Soldiers were tasked with handing out and overseeing over $100 million worth of these grants in 2008. When people sign up for the military, you aren't there to do what you want or expect to do. You're there to do what they need you to do. 9/11 placed an unprecedented demand for change on a massive organization, and I believe that the military successfully did their best with what they had. Do you agree or disagree with me? Did I miss an important part? Were you a soldier who witnessed this transformation from before 9/11 to post 9/11 military?
I don't really know what to think about that because I never deployed, but I worked with people all the time that talked about their experience and talked about, you know, what they went through. And a lot of them say the same stuff. The biggest thing that I think to gain and to understand is that people learn as they go. You figure things out as you go. No matter what a government or even a military is going to say, you know, that we've got everything figured out, until the bullets start flying and until you actually experience things and then learn from it and then build off of it. That's basically how everything is made. That's basically how we learn. You know, you make mistakes, you build off of them, and you grow. The big problem is that in the military, if you make a mistake, that's somebody's life. And that's something that is weighed heavily, you know, within the military. And something to think about, you know, looking at World War I, for example, perfect example. The French told the US that you cannot use battle tactics that were taught during that time, during World War I. You cannot just rush in mass towards the other side of a trench line through no man's land because you're going to get cut down by machine gun fire. Well, the United States at the time, I can't remember who was in charge at the, man, I'm blanking so bad. Anyway, we didn't listen. We had a huge force that rushed into this forest, maybe the Argonne. Regardless, they got absolutely lit up and we had crazy amount of casualties because we didn't listen to the French. But we learned from it and we adapted and we changed that. But then how many lives were lost because we didn't listen that first time? Or that had we not been told that, we still would have had to change how we did things. World War I's a great example to look at how the military changed a lot. You know, the French changing their uniforms from, you know, bright blue and bright red trousers to going with a horizon blue to try and blend in with the environment or the horizon or the blue sky that they were pushing across. There's some things to consider. But appreciate you all. Twitch will keep going, but YouTube, we will see you in the next one.
I got the shivers.